I'm happy to present you Professor Hanspeter Kriesi, which will give us the introductory lecture for these 3 days, the challenges to democracy in the 21st century. Hanspeter Kriesi is born in 1949 and he studied sociology. Master of Art in Sociology at the University of Chicago, Doctor of Philosophy in Sociology at the University of Zürich in 1976, in 1980, habilitation at the University of Zürich, 1984 to 1988, full professor for collective political behavior, University of Amsterdam, 1988 to 1992, full professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Geneva, 1991 to 2001, various functions at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin, at Swiss National Science Foundation, Nationalfonds, at the Cornell University, Ithaca, and the University of Geneva. Since 2002, professor for comparative politics at the University of Zurich. Since 2005, director of the NCCR, Challenges to Democracy in the 21st Century. We are happy that you found the way to Engelberg instead of different problems with the rail. Thank you for coming, and you have the floor, Professor.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about challenges to democracy against the background of the fact that, as Mr. Hug has told you, we have a big research program on this topic at the University of Zurich and at other universities in Switzerland. And what I would like to do today, I would like to introduce you to several challenges which we do not study, and then focus on the two challenges of globalization and mediatization. The word has already been used by the introductory speaker. I will focus on these two challenges. I will be a little bit handicapped because I thought I would have a screen here, but I have to read on the wall as you do. So first, some challenges which we do not study. There is a technological challenge that drives economic transformation, for example, deindustrialization, with a vast range of implications for politics. For example, the working class is reduced in size, and that means that the classical political potential for parties of the left is reduced, with consequences which you can see at every election in Western Europe today. There is also a technological change pending in the ways we are going to vote. There is electronic voting, and electronic voting will probably change a lot of the ways in which our current democracies work. There is democratic change. As you know, our populations are aging, which makes the life very difficult for politicians because they have to cut benefits in old age pensions, for example, which is difficult to do in democratic systems. These changes in demographics may partly drive some aspects of globalization, like immigration, to our Western European countries. And the Abbott already talked about the younger generation. Maybe the younger generation not always has to be listened to, because the younger generation abandons electoral democracy. They vote with their feet and don't participate in the democracy as we know it, as they should, maybe. There are challenges because socio-economic inequality and cultural heterogeneity are increasing in our societies. And one of our colleagues, an American, Larry Bartels, he has asked whether democracy is compatible with an increasing inequality of wealth. Democracy presupposes a society of equals. We are all equal, have an equal right to vote. What happens if we are becoming increasingly unequal? What happens if our societies become increasingly heterogeneous in terms of cultural backgrounds? What happens if some of our residents do not have the right to vote, as is the case in Switzerland for 20% of our residents because they come from culturally very distant backgrounds? There is finally a challenge which has to do with social cultural preference formation. As I already said, the young generations do no longer vote as we are used to. They prefer other types of political participation. We live in a movement society, as some of our colleagues have said, and this movement society expresses itself in political protest activities which are not conventional as electoral participation in the democracies as we used to know them. There are a lot of challenges. There are many open questions. There are few answers. And what I shall do today, I will certainly sketch the two challenges we are focusing on. I provide you with few answers, so do not expect from me, it's an introductory lecture, so I can allow myself to raise questions more than answering them. So globalization, the first key challenge. And my point of departure is a basic assumption. There is a basic assumption at the heart of democratic theory, and this assumption is the assumption of a congruence between decision makers and decision takers. The assumption is the assumption of a self-governing political community, of a demos, the members of which are locked into the territory of a nation state. Democracy as we know it today is national democracy, is closely tied to the territory of a nation state. And the assumption is that those who make the decisions for the nation state are those who represent the population residing in this nation state. That's the basic idea of how democracy works today. Now, this assumption in a globalizing world is breaking down. Today, this assumption is put into question by processes of globalization, or as we maybe prefer to say, of denationalization, of the dissolution of national boundaries, of the expansion, deepening, and acceleration of global interdependencies, and of the unbundling of territories. In the nation state, very different kinds of borders, political, cultural, administrative, military, economic borders all coincide. So they are packed together. The administrative authority stops at the border of the nation state. The military sovereignty stops at the border of the nation state. The political competence stops at the border of the nation state, and this is changing. It is changing for different relationships at different speeds. The economic integration has gone much further than the political integration, but even in politics, today the borders are dissolving. And the congruence, as a result of this process of denationalization, the congruence between the decision makers and the decision takers is breaking down in two analytically different ways. First of all, there are increasing horizontal incongruencies. There are transporter effects of political decisions in a given country, decisions in a given country which have effects on the residents of another country. First example, neighboring countries. The siting decisions of infrastructures have an impact on the residents of other countries. Take airports. The landing approach of Zurich Airport is a nuisance for some residents in the south of Germany. And these Germans retaliated and had their government close down the landing approach for the Swiss, which is now turning into a nuisance for some Swiss residents, highly densely populated regions, which are now covered by the landing approaches of Zurich Airport. And these people do not like it. So that's a first example. A second example, regulations. Regulations of some very distant countries have an impact on the populations of other countries. Take immigration. Immigration leads to a brain drain in many countries of the third world to places where the brains can be better remunerated. Or take industrial policy. East European countries become very attractive for industries which delocalize, as one says today. They move away from Switzerland to Hungary or Czechia or Slovakia. Banking regulations, a reverse example, regulations in Switzerland are highly attractive and provide an incentive for taxpayers in other countries. They lead to tax evasion, which again lead to retaliations of these other countries with respect to Swiss policy. You would say that's nothing new. We knew that before, and these transporter effects existed before. However, the world is changing, and these transporter effects in the course of the changes become ever more important. Capital markets are liberalizing, for example, and in a liberalized capital market economy, the banking regulations are much more important than they used to be in the past. Or airport traffic is increasing, so the nuisance of landing approaches is highly multiplied compared to the past. In addition, there are also horizontal incongruencies because of transporter effects within countries. In a federalist state like Switzerland, there is something like tax competition. You in Obwalden, you know that very well. And some are afraid that this tax competition leads to a race to the bottom. So all member states are increasingly, because of tax competition, forced to reduce their taxes, and in the end, the state does not have the necessary resources to fulfill its tasks. At the local level, same thing. We have a project which deals with this very particular problem. Metropolitan areas, because of increasing transport system, improved transport systems, are ever more larger, and new areas are included in metropolitan areas like Zurich. This not only creates transportation system problems, this also creates problems for democracy, because the metropolitan area is not a territorial unit which has a demos. The demos is either local or cantonal, but not metropolitan. So the metropolitan problems are not solved by a demos. There are also vertical incongruencies, and these are even more important than the horizontal ones, and they are quite new. The transporter effects of supranational political decision structures. There is the WTO, there is the IMF, the UN, and in particular for Europe, there is the European Union. And as far as I'm concerned, globalization in Europe means mainly and above all European integration. And you could say European integration is the last step in state formation in Europe. We had center formation at the level of the nation state, we had nation building, we had democratization at the level of the nation state. What happens now? We have center formation at the European level, we have formation of demos, that's the open question, to what extent at the level of Europe, and we have more or less democracy at the level of Europe. I come back to that question. This vertical incongruence is a response to the increasing global interdependencies. The externalities and spillovers, which I described before at the horizontal level, are attacked or are attempted to be solved by creating supranational governance structures. The chief benefit of the emerging multi-level governance structures is scale flexibility. You can try to solve the problem at the level where it is solvable. And some problems are only solvable at the global level, some at the national, and so forth. So scale flexibility is the great advantage of these structures. They are efficient. However, they have two kinds of problems, and I want to talk at some length about these two problems. They have a coordination problem and they have a demos problem. The solution to the coordination problem can be found in two types of structures. Lisbeth Hoche and Gary Marx, they distinguish type 1 governance structures. These are structures which we know in Switzerland very well. They are a kind of federalist structure. The units of this type of structure are territorial units, like states, like communities, like cantons. So these are general purpose, non-intersecting, hierarchically structured, durable jurisdictions. They are territorially defined units. There is a type 2 governance structure. We also know that in Switzerland because we know the Zweckverbände, especially at the local level. These are functionally specific, intersecting, overlapping, and flexible jurisdictions which are highly task-specific. So for each task, for example, the transportation system, the sewage system, the energy system, you have different types of jurisdictions which may be overlapping and so forth. The territorially defined systems, they are not such a problem for democracy because they are associated, each territorial unit is associated with the demos. But you have to coordinate in a multi-level governance structure multiple demoi, and a qualified or an unqualified majority of national demoi at the supranational level may impose a decision on a minority of demoi, or even worse, a minority of powerful national demoi may impose a decision on a majority of demoi. Concretely, the Swiss, if we join the European Union, we are a small demos, and we have few voting rights at the level of the European Union. So we might, in coalition with other small states, outvote the large state, but we might also be outvoted by the large states. That's a problem very many Swiss take very seriously. There is a type 2 problem. In type 2, the problem is much bigger because there is no corresponding demos. These functionally defined stakeholders replace territorially defined demoi. And you end up with something you might call advocacy democracy. That is, the collective actors which sit around the table are those who can credibly claim that they express strong preferences and defend causes that are central to the concern of them, a central concern to them. That is, interest groups, social movement organizations with highly specific interests are, because they have strong preferences, are determining decisions. And this we know also, we know that from corporatist channels of interest intermediation. But if this is to replace democracy as we know it, it's probably not very democratic. In addition, both types of solutions to the coordination problem lead to increasing complexity of the political process. You have an increasing number of stakeholders to whom national authorities are responsible. And Peter Mayer, in, I think, a highly instructive paper, he says there is an increasing contradiction between government and representative roles of parties. On the one hand, parties who govern are responsive and responsible to their voters. So, as representatives of national populations, they have to be accountable to their voters. But as members of decision-making processes at the supranational level, they also have to be responsive and accountable to other stakeholders. The European Commission, the Council of Europe, the WTO, central banks, the UN, and so forth. And that, these other stakeholders, for the Swiss population, they are not legitimate stakeholders, and they are not what you would call, some of them, democratically elected. There are increasingly long chains of delegation. Accountability becomes increasingly diffuse. The European Union is much remoter from the Swiss than the Federal Council. You have a remoteness of decision-making, and the caricaturists have captured that very well. You have increasing lack of transparency, increasing lack of control of the decision-making process by national parliaments and voters. You have what is called a presidentialization, even of parliamentary democracies. That is a reinforcement of executive power. And you see it here graphically. At the European Council meetings, it's the prime ministers and the presidents who meet, and parliament are absent from the debates. So the executive becomes ever more important in our political systems. The EU, is there something like democratic control in the EU? There is no democratic deficit in the European Union, say some observers. They are called the liberal intergovernmentalists. Andy Moravcik is a typical example. And he thinks there are elections in Europe. I mean, Parliament, European Parliament is elected. European Parliament has increasing competence, although the European Parliament does not elect European Commission. So the government is independent of Parliament. That's a little strange. The second chamber, the European Council, he says, is elected. These are national representatives. Indirectly, by national elections, there is legitimacy at the European level. And he says the European bureaucrats, they are highly supervised and controlled by the European Commission, by the European Parliament. Others say, like Adrien Héritier, they say there are new non-parliamentarian mechanisms of control. For example, what I called advocacy democracy before, that's happening at the European level, she says, and there are experts, scientific experts, experts of all types, who, coming from different countries, are looking for solutions together at the European level. And she thinks that's an alternative mechanism of control. There are also those who say there's a gigantic democratic deficit at the European level, and they point to the fact that the permissive consensus which has reigned until now among European populations is coming to an end. Europeans do no longer accept this democracy deficit and increasingly mobilize against this deficit. You have here one example. In 2005, I think, there were referendums in France and in the Netherlands against the Lisbon Treaty, and both referendums failed. So in both cases, the population said, we do not want this kind of Europe that you have concocted among yourselves. So there is increasing resistance against this democratic deficit. Is democratization possible at all at the supranational level? Some say, too fast. There is a problem of size. Political theorists like Robert Dahl, they say democracy is for the small scale. Democracy at the local level, that's the easiest. Democracy at the supranational level, that's almost impossible because the scale is too big. They say there's a lack of demos. In Europe, we don't have a European demos. We have Germans, Greeks, And the Germans are not very solidary with the Greeks, as we have just seen. They are Swiss, they are, and so forth. So we lack a demos. Some are less pessimistic in this respect. Habermas, for example, he takes a very Swiss position and says the political unification will create the demos. People will develop a kind of constitutional patriotism. They will become attached to these institutions. They will practice these institutions, and they will become a politically defined demos. What we have in Switzerland, we talk about Willensnation. We are culturally very diverse, but we have the same institutions, and we venerate our common institutions. Habermas says the Swiss are a perfect example of constitutional patriotism. Others say there's a lack of a center. Contrary to what many people in Switzerland think, Brussels is a very weak center. There are very few bureaucrats in Brussels, very few fiscal resources at the center. And those who think the paradigmatic case of nation-state building, that's France, think you need a strong center before you can democratize. Charles Tilly says there is also the weak path to democracy, the weak state path. And again, Switzerland would be the example. We had, at the beginning in 1848, an extremely weak center. The cantons were everything, but this center allowed, precisely because it was so weak, allowed for a lot of democratization. Actually, Matthias Königer-Kibuji, whom I wanted to invite here, but who could not come, he says there are actually no necessary conditions for democratization. You don't need a strong center. He has studied the literature, and on the basis of the study of the literature, he says, you don't need a strong center, you don't need cultural homogeneity, you don't need a high economic development, and you don't need much of economic equality. What you need is proper institutions. So that's what I have to say about the first challenge. You remember I had a second one. And the second one is mediatization. Mr. Hug has already used the word. And mediatization has something to do with the changing patterns of political communication. Political communication refers to the processes of communication between the decision makers and the decision takers, that is, between the representatives in parliament and in the executive on the one hand and the citizens on the other hand. And the archetypical political communication is the communication in an assembly. And the Athenian democracy was assembly democracy. You had the citizens of equals, but not only them. I mean, the Athenians also had to elect on a rotating basis political elites who were more equal than others. They were the representatives, the speakers, and the citizens were the audience. And the assembly was the public sphere. That's what you call assembly democracy. The modern representative democracy is no longer an assembly democracy. It's essentially a media-based democracy. The media provide the communication infrastructure for the public sphere, that is, for the debate between the representatives and the citizens. You still have assemblies, and in this region of Switzerland, you know it very well, there are Landsgemeinden. There are town meetings, there are local party sections. And for the internal coordination, the collective political actors, the parties and the interest groups and the social movements, they have a lot of assembly democracy. But for the large part of citizens, the public sphere today is a media-based public sphere. And that's why it is very important that the media currently undergo a double transformation. The first transformation concerns the diversification of the media channels and the multiplication of the media channels. Before I come to that, I sketch you how I perceive the golden age of the nation state in terms of political communication. You had public service model of broadcasting. You had nationally organized radio and television. And I remember when I was a child, at 12:30, at lunchtime, the whole nation was sitting at lunch table and was receiving, as it was called, the time signal from the observatory in Neuchâtel. You know you were of the same generation as I am. So, there is, Glauser is a Swiss author who writes very interesting detective stories, and his agent, he goes into a village, and his train happens to arrive at 12:30. The village streets are empty, and through the open windows he hears the time signal. So he describes this beautifully. That was in the 30s. I mean, he's an author who writes about the 30s. Nationwide programming and a national audience. The national audience was covered by national news at prime time. It was a captive audience. Everybody had the same message, a standardized notion of what counts and what does not count. And public service constitutionally mandated to non-partisan norms. By contrast, there was a very partisan print media. So those who were partisan, they could read the Vaterland, which was staunchly Catholic conservative, or they could read the NZZ, staunchly liberal. Left press was very small in Switzerland. Now, the first transformation is the proliferation and diversification of media channels. And two informed observers, Blümler and Kavanagh, they talk about the third age of political communication systems, which are characterized by an abundance, ubiquity, reach, and celerity of channels. A multiplication of channels. On the receiver end, you have an integration of this communication infrastructure in the people's homes. An integration which is technologically advancing very rapidly. You have now messages tailored to very specific identities, conditions, and tastes. You have selective exposure and widening cultural gaps. As a citizen, it is possible that you receive only information of like-minded people. You practically can exclude exposure to voices which are of a different mind as you are. Kees Sandstein, in a small book about the internet, already almost 10 years ago, he talks about the Balkanization of the public sphere. And he is very pessimistic about that. He says what is happening today is a segmentation of the public into like-minded people, with the consequence of polarization and of a lack of debate between different positions. So what you have is a fragmentation of the demos from within as a result of these developments in political communication. The second driving force of mediatization is commercialization. With the admission of private broadcasting channels, you got into an increasingly commercial logic, which is oriented toward consumers' demands. But my colleagues from communication tell me consumers cannot control the quality of news because news is a credence good. You as a consumer are unlikely to be able to evaluate the quality of the news even after you have consumed the news. That's why reputation of the channels of news communication is so important. So this makes that the consumers are not as powerful as some might suggest. The really powerful people are the investors, the advertisers, and the sources of the media. Now, the mediatization theory says that the media, because of commercialization, are increasingly following their own commercial logic in selecting, presenting, and interpreting political news. The media logic, it is said, reflects the commercial logic of the media industry. The media present politics according to their own criteria. They pay selective attention to politics. They set the agenda by defining the relevant problems and leaving out others. They construct the relevance of certain personalities. If you are not compatible with Arena, you have no chance. You cannot become a famous Swiss politician. And the media become even a political actor in their own right. That is, they intervene in favor of certain political positions. That happened very graphically some years ago in Belgium with the white marches, where the media appealed to the people to organize white marches against the scandals happening in that country. Now, the politicians, what do they have to do? They have to adapt to this logic. They have no choice. And some politicians have very well adapted, as you know. Now, the pessimists, there are two views of what is happening here. The pessimists say we are going in the direction of a mediocracy. The media are capable of manipulating the voters, and our democracy is going down the drain. Political news, Pierre Bourdieu, he wrote that already a long time ago. Political news is increasingly replaced by les faits divers, trivialities of daily life, which creates political indifference. And if you watch the news channels in Italian television, you certainly think that there is some truth to this. Or if you read 20 Minuten, the most read Swiss newspaper, don't forget this. The coverage is almost twice as large as the coverage of any other newspaper in Switzerland. So if you read this, there must be some truth to this. There is selective information, as Cass Sunstein already warned, creates polarization, and this contributes also to presidentialization, to the focus on a few highly visible leaders. So globalization, which also goes in the direction of enhancing leaders, and mediatization, they both go into the same direction. Focus on a few leaders, which is very much against the tradition as we know it in Switzerland. And finally, there is a sort of media populism which plays into the hands of populist leaders. There is a sort, Gianpietro Mazzoleni, not by accident an Italian observer, he says there is some kind of media complicity with populist leaders because the media populism caters to populist tastes by dramatizing, personalizing, and by providing spin and sound bites instead of substance. The optimists, Lisbeth van Zonen, Dutch communication scientist, she says, in fact, populism is not that bad because populism leads to greater inclusion of people who normally, they can't read the NZZ. I mean, they cannot read quality papers, but by the populist discourse in some kind of media, people who normally do not understand politics, they are becoming interested in politics and they are understanding some elements of politics which makes them participate in politics. Secondly, media effects, many people say, are not as important as they are made out to be. Media campaigns actually mainly reinforce pre-existing political predispositions. And third, politicians are still in the driver's seat. There's a very famous quote by Herbert Gans which says that although it takes two to tango, Either sources or journalists can lead, but more often than not, it is the sources who do the leading. That is, the sources are the politicians and not the journalists. You know this example, and I give you this example to illustrate pessimists and optimists. It's the Monica Lewinsky affair of Bill Clinton, which preoccupied the American public for more than 1 year. I mean, they were able to write about this scandal abundantly, and because of this scandal, they didn't write about more substantive elements. The pessimists say this contributes, the pessimists say, to the reduction of politics to an irrelevant spectator sport. It leads to an anti-political reflex. It leads to depoliticization and indifference, and it leads to the decoupling of input and output processes. Input, I mean, the public debates this affair, but politics goes on. They take decisions behind the scenes, and nobody writes about these decisions, so output processes are decoupled from input processes. The optimists. This Zaller, as an example, he says, this example shows that the American public still puts more emphasis on substance than on personal errors and lies. Because what happened to Bill Clinton? He was re-elected. And why was he re-elected? He was re-elected in spite of his errors and lies, because he provided the American people with the three most important things, says Zaller: peace, prosperity, and moderation. He was a moderate leader, and in all the countries, the electorate likes moderate leaders. Now, to conclude, I want to give you a Swiss example. This is now an example of our research program. We have studied 3 direct democratic campaigns. We have studied the asylum campaign. You remember there was a referendum on a very tough asylum law. The left launched a referendum. There was the naturalization initiative, Einbürgerungsinitiative of the SVP. There was a nasty campaign with respect to this initiative, and there was a campaign in February 2008 on the reform of the corporate tax law. The possible campaign effects that I distinguish here are reinforcement of previous predispositions. That is, the campaign did not change the opinion of the people, it just reinforced what the people were anyway up to vote. Activation. At the beginning, people did not necessarily know what they wanted to vote, but they had latent predisposition. For example, a xenophobe was was in favor of the tough asylum law because it's in line with his xenophobic predisposition. So if in the end a xenophobic person voted in favor of the law, although in the beginning that person did not know how to vote, we would say that's activation. And conversion is if in the end people vote against their latent predispositions. That's the way we define conversion. People are persuaded away from their original predispositions. Now, see the distribution. That's the way our samples distributed over these 3 effects. And you see, reinforcement is by far the most important effect. Especially in the case of the asylum law, but also in the other 2 cases, reinforcement is the strongest effect. But there are other effects, and in the case of the naturalization initiative, activation was very strong. That has to do with the fact that in the beginning, the people did not exactly know what this initiative was about, because this initiative mixed questions of immigration with questions of democratic decision-making. And it was a very able and subtle mix which induced people in the beginning to think differently than their actual predisposition, but they ended up voting very much like their actual predispositions. You see, 90% voted as the would have voted had they known everything about the issue. So because activation is so strong sometimes, we could say, and we do say that, campaigns have an enlightening effect. Campaigns actually incite the people to vote as they would have voted had they been very well informed. They inform them, they improve their knowledge about the links between the issue and their predispositions. And finally, you see there is a case which leads to more preoccupied interpretations. That's the corporate tax law. The corporate tax law was extremely complicated. People had great difficulties to understand what this was all about, and 20% of the people ended up voting against their predispositions. It was a very close call, so you could say in this case, those who did not know what it was all about made the difference. I end up with Habermas. Habermas wrote a very famous book, you know, Structural Change of the Public Sphere. That's a book of the early 60s. That was his Habilitationsschrift. He became famous with this book. And there was a second edition to this book in 1990. And he wrote a very long preface, about 70 pages long, for this second edition. And it is very interesting because originally he was extremely pessimist about the impact of the media on the public sphere and on democratic systems. So he was in the tradition of the Frankfurt School, and they were extremely pessimist. But 1989 was an event in Germany, the revolutionary change in the GDR. And the TV coverage of mass demonstrations in the GDR turned the physical presence of the protesters in the streets into an omnipresent phenomenon. So because the East Germans could see West German television, and West German television was covering these protest demonstrations, the whole of the GDR was informed about what was happening. And this contributed greatly to the transition in the GDR. So Habermas, under the impact still of this century event, he came to the conclusion that the democratic potential of the public sphere under contemporary conditions is ambivalent. It's no longer uniquely pessimistic, his conclusion, it's an ambivalent conclusion, and I think that's the best what we can say at present. The things are ambivalent, the optimists and the pessimists have something to tell. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Kriesi. I think it was a very interesting, very clear, and a very helpful introductory lecture you gave to us. Thank you very much. I think we have time for one or two questions if you want to put the question. Professor Abel.
Thank you very much for your talk. I would like just to give a complementary aspect to your challenges and saying that in having increasing challenges, at the same time we have also increasing chances for democracy, and you have touched some of these aspects. I would just to emphasize another one. If you talk about your vertical and horizontal incongruencies, I think this is also a chance. It's on one side a challenge, but at the same time a big chance, because asked the question under the conditions of globalization and intercultural situation, what might be the form of political rule adequate or which corresponds to this type of incongruencies, we end up saying this is democracy. And this, for me, seems to be a very basic philosophical foundational element for democracy in favor of and against other forms of political rule. So I think there are not only challenges, but chances in that, and the difficulty is to spell out the procedural mechanisms for these chances, and then to elevate, so to speak, the security of freedom, of individual freedom in democracy, localized and nationalized, bounded, at the international level and how to create procedures? That's the big question. Thank you.
Shall I respond? Yeah. The expert group of our program has already criticized us that we tend to see the difficulties and the problems and not the opportunities. And I'm glad that you make this comment, because indeed, I mean, you could say the internet is a gigantic chance. And there are people like Sunstein who say, I talked about Cass Sunstein, I didn't talk about the gigantic chances which are involved, or some people think it's a gigantic chance. But anyway, what you say is very appropriate, and of course you also say finding the appropriate rules is not very easy. And we have a speaker, I think on Friday morning, Francis Schöneval, who maybe can enlighten us in precisely this respect. What are the appropriate procedures for a supranational democracy? He talks about democracy, a democracy with many demoi, and he talks about how one could find rules to make these many demoi cooperate and find decisions in a way that are legitimate to everybody.
Thank you. Please, Professor Winter.
However, you did not mention the most important fact of the media, namely disinformation. That is the big challenge that the media should face better sooner than later. Just think of the Waldsterben. It has disappeared. Think of the highly infective bird flu virus, who has disappeared after some 15 birds have died. Think of the flu, of the swine flu, formerly Mexican flu. And think of cholesterol that is dying right now. It goes away. And yet one has made, with all these statins, that those are medicaments that can lower the cholesterol level in some patients, one has made enormous fortune. It is the disinformation that is dangerous to democracy. And I want to say one more thing, and this is mainly addressed to the females in this audience. The basic ointment was formerly made by Siba Geige. I don't know who makes it now, but it's all the same. And it costs per kilogram or so, maybe $1 or $1.50. But if you put an orchid in it, or even some caviar, then it becomes highly valuable, and you can put it on your wrinkles in the face and on the rest of the body. It's that disinformation that you're victim of.
I mean, disinformation. Let's take the example of Waldsterben. There's a lot to say about this, but I said it takes two to tango, Herbert Gans. It takes the sources and the media. Who are the sources in the case of Waldsterben? It's the experts. The experts tell us the forests are going to die. What does the journalist know? He listens to the expert. Let's take what we have right now. We have a big economic crisis. You don't think so, but we have a big economic crisis. I mean, the Swiss are very privileged, but let's go to America. Go to see the film Cleveland versus Wall Street. You get a small idea of what is happening. We have a big economic crisis. Some experts say, Krugman, a Nobel Prize winner, he says, stimulate the economy, deficit spending, Keynesian medicine. Okay, Krugman. And then you have European economists. like Hans-Werner Sinn, not a Nobel Prize winner, but a very respected German economist. He says, austerity. He says these Americans, they are crazy. The German government makes austerity measures. The Greeks are condemned to take austerity measures all over Europe. Cameron, he makes austerity policies. What is right? I mean, the journalist, he does not know. He writes what the expert tells him. And to some extent, the problem is, in this case, this information is not a problem of the media, but a problem of the sources. I give you a last example, the example of climate change. Virtually all experts are saying that the climate is indeed changing because of certain mechanisms which have to do with the way humans behave. It's human-made. But there are some experts who pretend the opposite. There's a famous Dane, Lomqvist, or what's his name? He says exactly the opposite. Now, Lomborg. Now, in this case, I think, the media have a responsibility. If the media give equal space to this crazy expert who contradicts virtually all other scientists, then the media are behaving in a way which I mean, the media have the neutrality norm. They have to give both sides. And they can extend this neutrality norm, I think, to great lengths. But on the other hand, diversity is a quality of the media. They have to give everybody's opinion. And if they don't do so, one says they are one-sided, they are partisan, and so forth.